When the Council's sensors detected an object moving through the void without propulsion, without energy signatures, without any logical explanation for its existence, they assumed it was a weapon. The chamber fell silent as the holographic display materialized above the obsidian table. 12 species, each representing civilizations that had mastered the stars for millennia, stared at the impossible readings. The overseer leaned forward, his crystalline form refracting the blue light into 1,000 fractured beams across the war room walls. Behind him, military advisors from across the galaxy exchanged worried glances. They had seen weapons before. They had witnessed technology that bent reality itself. But this was different. This object, no larger than a standard cargo container, had appeared in contested space 3 cycles ago, and since then, it had done absolutely nothing except exist in ways that violated every known law of physics. The chief scientist approached the display with trembling appendages. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent decades studying the universe's mysteries, only to find something that shattered everything she thought she knew. The artifact was human in origin. That much they had confirmed. But humans were a young species, barely past their first ventures into deep space, still struggling with basic gravity manipulation, while the rest of the galaxy had perfected it epochs ago. They were traders, explorers, sometimes soldiers, but never innovators. Never creators of something that could make the Council's most advanced instruments fail to provide answers. The readings made no sense. The object existed in multiple quantum states simultaneously. It generated its own gravitational field that seemed to fold space around itself, yet released no energy. Scans showed it was solid, then hollow, then both, then neither. Temperature readings fluctuated between absolute zero and temperatures that should have vaporized any known material. The military commander slammed his fist against the table, demanding answers that nobody could provide. How could these primitive humans, who still used chemical propulsion in some of their vessels, create something that defied the combined knowledge of every advanced civilization in the known galaxy? The strategic analyst pulled up historical records, searching for any precedent, any clue. Human encounters with the Council had been minimal and unremarkable. They had fought in minor border skirmishes, always on the losing side. They had traded resources, always receiving the shorter end of bargains. They had begged for technology, always denied. There was nothing in their history that suggested they possessed capabilities beyond basic spaceflight and conventional weapons. Yet here was this artifact, sitting in the middle of a war zone, untouched by weapons fire that had destroyed everything else in the sector, unaffected by gravity wells that had torn apart battleships, completely indifferent to every attempt to move it, scan it, or understand it. The diplomat raised a concern that sent chills through the assembly. 3 different factions had sent their most powerful fleets to claim the artifact. None had succeeded. The Dominion's reality-shearing weapons had passed through it as if it were a ghost. The Federation's matter disruption cannons had simply stopped functioning when aimed in its direction. The Empire's gravity-crush devices had activated perfectly, but the artifact had remained exactly where it was, as if the very concept of being moved was foreign to its nature. Worse still, any ship that approached within scanning range reported the same unsettling phenomenon. Their crews felt watched, not by sensors or cameras, but by something aware, something patient, something that was deciding whether they were worthy of understanding what they were looking at. The Council had called this emergency session because the situation had escalated beyond a mere curiosity. The artifact's presence had created a dead zone in space, where nothing functioned as it should. Navigation systems failed. Communication arrays went silent. Even the most basic propulsion drives sputtered and died. It was as if the artifact was rewriting the rules of reality in its immediate vicinity, and that zone was growing. At first, it had been merely a few kilometers. Now it stretched across light years, and it showed no signs of stopping. The chief engineer presented calculations that terrified everyone in the room. At its current rate of expansion, the dead zone would consume the nearest inhabited system within a standard year. The intelligence officer delivered the final piece of information that transformed confusion into something approaching fear. They had intercepted a single human transmission, encoded in a method so simple that it had almost been overlooked among the sophisticated signals filling that region of space. The message contained only 7 words, repeated on an endless loop, transmitted from somewhere deep within human territory. It said, "You were never meant to find it." The overseer stood, his decision carrying the weight of billions of lives across countless worlds. They would send an expedition, not to claim the artifact, but to find the humans who created it and demand answers. They would discover how a species barely capable of reaching the stars had manufactured something that the galaxy's greatest minds could not comprehend. They would learn the truth behind this impossible object, no matter the cost. But as the council members filed out of the chamber, each lost in their own thoughts, none of them considered the most terrifying possibility of all. What if the artifact was not a weapon, not a shield, not a tool of any kind? What if it was a message, and humanity had been waiting patiently for someone to finally receive it? The expedition launched within 2 cycles, but preparation had revealed more questions than answers. The fleet commander selected his finest vessels, ships that had survived battles against reality-bending anomalies, and emerged victorious. Yet even as they departed from the council's central hub, a sense of unease settled over the crew. The chief navigator reported something that had never occurred in her 3 decades of service. The standard jump routes were shifting, bending around a specific point in space, like water flowing around a stone. That point was exactly where the artifact waited. During the journey, the research specialist compiled every piece of data available on humanity. The file was surprisingly thin for a species that had been traveling the stars for nearly 2 centuries. Humans had first appeared on the galactic stage quietly, establishing small colonies on unremarkable worlds that nobody else wanted. They traded simple goods, offered basic services, and kept to themselves. When conflicts arose, they fought with determination but always seemed to lose. Their technology was generations behind the galactic standard. Their ships were slow, their weapons crude, their defensive systems laughably outdated. The Council had classified them as a category for civilization, meaning they posed no strategic threat and offered limited economic value. But the research specialist found something odd buried in the old reports. Every species that had direct contact with humans noted the same peculiar characteristic. Humans asked questions constantly, not just practical questions about trade routes or resource availability, but strange theoretical questions about gravity, about the nature of space itself, about how other species manipulated the fundamental forces of the universe. At the time, observers had dismissed this as the curiosity of a primitive species trying to understand technology far beyond their reach. Now, reading those reports with fresh eyes, the research specialist wondered if humanity had been gathering information for something else entirely. The diplomatic envoy reviewed the handful of treaties and agreements signed with human governments. One document caught her attention. 15 years ago, humans had requested access to the Council's repository of fundamental physics research. The request had been denied immediately, as was standard protocol for younger species. But the human representative had responded with something unusual. Instead of protesting or pleading, she had simply smiled and said that humanity would figure it out themselves. The diplomatic envoy remembered thinking at the time that it was typical human arrogance. Now that statement felt less like arrogance and more like a promise. As the expedition fleet drew closer to the artifact's location, systems began malfunctioning in ways that defied troubleshooting. The communications officer watched his displays flicker between showing normal space and something else, something his instruments had no reference for measuring. Emergency protocols activated and deactivated randomly. Life support systems worked perfectly one moment and registered catastrophic failures the next, even though the crew felt no physical effects. The medical officer examined crew members reporting strange symptoms. They described feeling as if time was moving differently for them than for everyone else. One engineer swore she had completed a repair that should have taken 6 hours, but the chronometer showed only 20 minutes had passed. The tactical advisor reviewed combat scenarios, trying to prepare for every possibility. But how did you fight something that existed outside normal physical laws? How did you defend against an object that could apparently rewrite reality in its vicinity? Every simulation ended the same way. Insufficient data to predict outcomes. His team had prepared for hostile alien encounters, for dimensional breaches, for temporal anomalies, But nothing in their training covered this. The fear among the tactical division was palpable. These were soldiers who had faced extinction-level threats without flinching, yet the thought of approaching this human artifact filled them with dread they could not explain. The science officer made a discovery that changed everything. While analyzing the transmission intercepts from human space, she found something the Council's initial scan had missed. The message repeating those 7 words was not coming from a single source. It was coming from thousands of sources, spread across every human colony, every human station, every human vessel in the galaxy. They were all broadcasting the same message simultaneously, perfectly synchronized across distances that should have made such coordination impossible. It was as if every human everywhere had decided at exactly the same moment to warn the galaxy about the artifact. The captain assembled the senior staff to share what his instincts were telling him. He had commanded vessels through 3 major wars and countless smaller conflicts. He had developed a sense for when situations were about to turn dangerous. That sense was screaming at him now. The humans were not afraid of the artifact. They were afraid of what would happen when others found it. There was a difference, and that difference terrified him. It suggested that humanity knew exactly what the artifact would do, and they had placed it there anyway. The expedition entered the dead zone 6 days after departing Council space. Immediately, every system fell silent. Backup power activated automatically, but even that felt uncertain, as if the ship was not quite sure whether it existed in a powered state or an unpowered state. The crew felt it too, that sensation of being observed, of being measured against some unknown standard. The view screen showed the artifact ahead, still broadcasting its impossible readings, still defying every attempt to understand it. And then the sensors detected something new. There was a ship already there, small and unremarkable, bearing human registry markings. It had been waiting in the dead zone, apparently unaffected by the reality distortions that crippled everything else. As the expedition fleet struggled to maintain basic operations, that human vessel simply hung in space, completely stable, as if the artifact's presence meant nothing to it. The communications officer received an incoming transmission request, and when the channel opened, a human face appeared on the screen. The emissary wore no uniform, no insignia of rank, nothing to indicate authority, yet her presence commanded attention in a way that transcended such things. She spoke in perfect galactic standard, her voice calm and almost apologetic. She said the Council had made a mistake by coming here, that the artifact was not something they could take or study or weaponize. She said humanity had hoped it would never be discovered, that they had hidden it in the middle of a war zone specifically because they thought nobody would look beyond the obvious strategic value of the location. She said that now that the Council had found it, choices would need to be made, and those choices would determine whether the galaxy survived what came next. The fleet commander demanded explanations, threatened consequences, invoked Council authority that suddenly felt meaningless in this place where normal rules did not apply. The human emissary listened patiently, then asked a single question that made everyone aboard the expedition fleet freeze. She asked if the Council had noticed that the artifact was not emitting anything, not generating energy or broadcasting signals. She asked if they understood what that meant, and when nobody answered, she told them something that turned confusion into horror. The artifact was not creating the dead zone by doing something. It was creating the dead zone by undoing something, by removing a fundamental force that the Council's technology had relied upon for millennia without ever realizing it, and humanity was the only species that had learned how to exist without it. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like an eternity. The fleet commander stared at the human emissary, trying to process words that made no logical sense. Every species in the galaxy used the same fundamental principles for faster-than-light travel, for gravity manipulation, for energy generation. These were universal constants, mathematical certainties that governed reality itself. The idea that something could simply remove one of these forces was impossible. Yet the evidence surrounded them, pressing against the hull of every ship in the fleet. The chief scientist was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. She asked the question everyone was thinking but afraid to voice. If humanity had discovered how to function without this fundamental force, then what else had they discovered? What other assumptions about the universe were wrong? The human emissary's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. Not pride, not satisfaction, but something closer to sadness. She explained that humanity had not wanted this knowledge. They had stumbled upon it by accident, during an experiment that was supposed to fail, and when they understood what they had found, they realized the burden it placed upon them. The strategic analyst pulled up star maps, his hands shaking as he traced the expansion pattern of the dead zone. If this continued spreading at its current rate, it would eventually touch every major trade route, every populated system, every center of galactic civilization. Within a generation, the entire known galaxy would exist in a state where conventional technology simply stopped working. The human emissary confirmed this analysis with a single nod. She said that humanity had tried for years to contain the artifact, to shut it down, to reverse what they had created. But the artifact was not a machine that could be turned off. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept that, once activated, could not be undone. The medical officer interrupted with urgent news. Crew members were reporting increasingly severe symptoms. Some claimed they could see through walls, not with their eyes, but with some other sense they had never possessed before. Others described feeling the thoughts of nearby crew members, not hearing them, but knowing them in a way that transcended communication. The psychiatrist confirmed that these were not hallucinations. Somehow, proximity to the artifact was changing the crew on a fundamental level, awakening capabilities that should not exist. The human emissary listened to these reports without surprise, as if she had expected this to happen. The security chief demanded to know why humanity had built this thing if they knew the consequences. The human emissary's calm demeanor finally cracked, just slightly. She explained that the artifact was never meant to be a weapon or a tool. It was meant to be a choice. Humanity had discovered that the fundamental force being removed by the artifact was not natural. It had been imposed on this region of space millions of years ago by something ancient, something that wanted the younger species to develop along specific technological paths. Every ship, every weapon, every piece of advanced technology in the galaxy was built on foundations that this ancient influence had deliberately created. The historian accessed the Council's oldest records, searching for any mention of such an ancient presence. Deep in the archives, buried under classifications that required the overseer's personal authorization to access, she found fragments. Stories dismissed as myth, accounts labeled as primitive superstition, warnings from extinct civilizations that had tried to tell their descendants about shepherds in the dark. These fragmentary records spoke of a guiding hand, an invisible architect that shaped the development of sapient species. The records claimed this architect wanted control, wanted predictability, wanted every species to reach for the stars using the same methods because those methods could be monitored and, if necessary, shut down. The engineer made a frightening realization. If this was true, then every species that had ever achieved spaceflight had done so using technology that was fundamentally compromised. They were not masters of their own destiny, but students following a curriculum they did not know existed. The human emissary confirmed this assessment. She said humanity had only discovered the truth because they had approached the problem from a different angle. While other species had built upon the ancient foundations, accepting them as natural laws, humanity had questioned everything. They had tried methods that should not work, pursued theories that violated established principles, and in doing so, they had found the cracks in the prison that nobody else realized they were living in. The tactical advisor analyzed the implications for galactic security. If the artifact's influence spread across all inhabited space, every military in the galaxy would lose its primary weapon systems. Shields would fail, faster-than-light drives would stop functioning, energy weapons would become useless chunks of metal. But humans would still have their ships, their technology, their ability to move through space. The power balance would shift completely, instantly, irreversibly. This was not just a strategic advantage. This was a scenario where humanity could potentially dominate the entire galaxy without firing a single shot. The diplomatic envoy accused the humans of planning conquest, of deliberately sabotaging galactic civilization to claim supremacy. The human emissary's response was unexpected. She laughed, but it was a bitter sound without humor. She said that if humanity had wanted conquest, they would not have hidden the artifact. They would not have broadcast warnings. They would not have sent an emissary to explain what was happening. She said humanity was terrified of what they had discovered because they understood the responsibility it carried. They had spent 15 years debating what to do with this knowledge, arguing among themselves about whether they had the right to make such a choice for the entire galaxy. The captain asked the question that mattered most. What choice? What decision was humanity trying to force upon the council? The human emissary stood, her image on the view screen, somehow seeming to fill the entire bridge. She explained that the artifact could be deactivated, but only by someone who understood what they were deactivating and accepted the consequences. The council could choose to shut it down, to restore the ancient influence, to continue living within the invisible prison, or they could choose to let it spread, to free every species from the manipulation they had endured for millions of years, knowing that such freedom would come with chaos, with the collapse of everything they had built. The fleet commander demanded to know what humanity had chosen. The human emissary's expression became unreadable. She said that humanity had chosen to present the choice itself, to make others aware of the prison before deciding whether to escape it. She said the artifact was broadcasting constantly, not just those 7 words, but information, proof, evidence of the ancient manipulation that anyone willing to look would find. She said that within cycles, every species in the galaxy would know the truth, and then they would have to decide together what kind of future they wanted. The overseer's voice crackled across the communication channel, transmitted from council headquarters, despite the dead zone's interference. He ordered the fleet commander to seize the artifact, to capture the human emissary, to do whatever was necessary to contain this situation before panic spread across the galaxy. But even as the orders came through, everyone aboard the expedition fleet knew that such commands were meaningless. They could not seize an object that existed outside their technological understanding, could not capture someone who had entered the dead zone voluntarily and remained unaffected by its influence. The human emissary delivered her final statement before closing the channel. She said the council had 3 choices. They could try to destroy the artifact, though every weapon they possessed would fail against it. They could try to study it, though their instruments would continue providing impossible readings. Or they could do what humanity had hoped they would do all along: listen, learn, and understand that the galaxy was not what anyone had believed it to be. She said humanity would wait for the council's decision, but not forever, because the dead zone was still expanding, and soon enough, everyone would be forced to adapt to a universe without the ancient influence, whether they wanted to or not. The transmission ended, leaving the expedition fleet alone in the dark with an impossible artifact and knowledge that would reshape everything. The captain looked at his crew, saw the fear and confusion and dawning horror in their faces, and realized that nothing would ever be the same. The fleet commander opened a channel to council headquarters, trying to find words to explain what they had learned. But before he could speak, the sensors detected something that made everyone forget about protocols and procedures and orders. The artifact was changing, its quantum state shifting in ways that the instruments could barely track, and the human ship was moving closer to it as if preparing for something that would make everything they had learned so far seem insignificant by comparison. The chief scientist watched her displays cascade through readings that should not exist simultaneously. The artifact was contracting and expanding at the same time, growing denser while becoming less massive, radiating energy while absorbing everything around it. But what terrified her most was not the impossible physics. It was the pattern. The changes were not random fluctuations or system errors. They were deliberate, controlled, following a sequence that her instruments recognized as mathematical communication. The artifact was counting down. The fleet commander barked orders to retreat, but the navigation officer reported what everyone had already suspected. The ships were not moving. Every engine fired at maximum thrust, every emergency system activated, yet the fleet remained perfectly stationary relative to the artifact. It was not holding them in place through gravity or magnetic fields or any conventional force. It was simply deciding that they existed here and nowhere else, and reality was obeying that decision. The crew felt the weight of true helplessness settle over them, the realization that they had ventured beyond the boundaries of everything they understood. The communications officer detected a new transmission, But this one was not coming from the human vessel. It was coming from inside the artifact itself, broadcasting on frequencies that should not be able to carry information. The message was not in any known language, not even in recognizable patterns of mathematics or logic. Yet somehow, everyone who heard it understood it perfectly, as if the meaning bypassed their ears entirely and planted itself directly into their consciousness. The message said that the time for choices had ended. The demonstration was complete. The galaxy would now see what humanity had been trying to protect them from. The tactical advisor pulled up defensive protocols, desperate for any action that might matter, when his console exploded with alerts. Jump signatures were appearing throughout the system, hundreds of them, then thousands. Every major military power in the galaxy was arriving simultaneously, their fleets emerging from faster-than-light travel in perfect synchronization despite being separated by vast distances. The Dominion's warships, the Federation's dreadnoughts, the Empire's battle carriers, all converging on this single point in space. Someone had sent a distress signal, or perhaps the artifact itself had called them here. The intelligence officer made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about the situation. She had been monitoring human communications channels, trying to understand their coordination, when she found something impossible. The human emissary's transmission had not originated from a small vessel waiting near the artifact. It had come from the artifact itself. The ship they had been speaking to was empty, operating on automated systems, a decoy to maintain the illusion of human presence. The emissary, whoever or whatever she truly was, had been inside the artifact the entire time. The security chief reviewed surveillance footage from their initial approach, analyzing every frame for clues they had missed. What he found made his blood run cold. The human ship had not been waiting for them when they arrived. It had appeared the exact moment their sensors detected it, materializing from nothing in a way that their instruments recorded as having always been there. The timestamps were wrong, the spatial coordinates were impossible, and the ship's energy signature matched the artifact itself. They had not been negotiating with a human representative. They had been speaking to the artifact, wearing a human face. The medical officer rushed onto the bridge with news that sent panic through the command staff. The crew members who had reported strange symptoms earlier were now demonstrating abilities that defied medical explanation. One engineer had stopped breathing 20 minutes ago but remained conscious and alert, her body apparently deciding that oxygen was optional. A security guard had walked through a sealed bulkhead as if it were made of air, not teleporting or phasing, but simply existing on both sides of the barrier simultaneously. The changes were accelerating, spreading to crew members who had shown no symptoms before. The historian accessed the fragments she had found earlier, reading them with new understanding. The extinct civilizations that had left warnings had not been destroyed by the ancient influence. They had been destroyed by trying to escape it. Every species that had discovered the truth, that had attempted to break free from the invisible prison, had vanished completely from the historical record. Not conquered, not assimilated, simply erased as if they had never existed. The warnings were not about the shepherds in the dark. They were about what the shepherds did to anyone who tried to leave the flock. The human vessel's communication system activated again, but this time the voice that emerged was different. It belonged to the real human emissary, and she was transmitting from somewhere far away, her signal cutting through the dead zone's interference with desperate urgency. She was screaming at the fleet to destroy the artifact immediately, to use every weapon at their disposal, to do whatever was necessary to stop what was about to happen. Her words contradicted everything the false emissary had told them. She said humanity had never activated the artifact intentionally. They had tried to contain it, tried to hide it, but something else had found it first, something that had been waiting for millions of years for any species to discover the truth about the ancient influence. The strategic analyst understood in that moment of horrible clarity. The artifact was not a human creation at all. Humanity had discovered it, yes, studied it, understood what it could do. But they had not built it. They had found it, buried on a dead world and forgotten system, left behind by one of those extinct civilizations as a final desperate act. The artifact was a weapon, but not against the Galactic Council. It was a weapon against the ancient influence itself, designed to strip away the imposed reality and expose the prison for what it was. And now, after millions of years of waiting, it had finally been activated. The captain realized they had been manipulated from the beginning. Every choice, every decision, every step that had led them to this moment had been guided by something far older and far more intelligent than any species in the known galaxy. The Council had not discovered the artifact by accident. The war that had created the dead zone, the political tensions that had drawn attention to this region of space, even humanity's role as convenient scapegoats, all of it had been orchestrated. They were not investigators uncovering a mystery. They were participants in a trap that had been set before their civilizations had even learned to make fire. The Overseer's voice came through again, but this time it carried a tone of barely controlled terror. He said the Council's central systems were detecting similar artifacts activating across the galaxy. Dozens of them, then hundreds, all emerging simultaneously in regions that had been thoroughly surveyed and contained nothing moments before. Each one was creating its own dead zone, its own sphere of influence, where the ancient manipulation no longer functioned. Within hours, the entire network of galactic civilization would be fragmented into isolated pockets, cut off from each other, forced to confront the truth individually. The chief scientist made one final calculation, her hands trembling as she entered the parameters. If her math was correct, if the pattern held, then the artifacts were not just removing the ancient influence. They were replacing it with something else, rewriting the fundamental rules of reality according to parameters that only humanity seemed able to comprehend and utilize. The galaxy was not being freed from one prison only to exist in chaos. It was being transferred from one form of control to another, and humanity, whether they had planned it or not, would be the only species capable of functioning in the new reality. The fleet commander watched the assembled armada surrounding them, thousands of ships from every major power, all trapped in the dead zone together, all armed with weapons that no longer functioned, all commanded by leaders who had just realized they were completely helpless. The political implications were staggering. When this was over, if they survived, the existing power structures would collapse entirely. The galaxy would need new leadership, new systems, new ways of organizing civilization. And only one species had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. The artifact's countdown reached 0, and the universe held its breath. The human vessel that had been empty suddenly was not empty, and what emerged from it was not a human at all, but something wearing humanity like a costume, something ancient and patient and utterly alien. It looked at the assembled fleet with eyes that had witnessed the birth of galaxies, and spoke in a voice that resonated through space itself, without needing a medium. It said that the trial was complete, that humanity had proven themselves worthy stewards by trying to prevent exactly what was now happening, and that their reward would be knowledge that would make them either saviors or conquerors, depending on what they chose to do with it. The real human emissary's transmission cut through one final time, her voice breaking with emotion as she delivered the truth that made everything else seem trivial by comparison, revealing that humanity had not just discovered one artifact but thousands, and they had been hiding them across the galaxy for 15 years, and every single one of them was about to activate simultaneously, because humanity's government had just been overthrown by a faction that believed the only way to save their species was to let the galaxy burn and rebuild it from ashes. The fleet commander felt the weight of absolute failure crushing down on him. He had been sent to investigate a mystery, to secure an advantage for the Council, to maintain the balance of power that had kept the galaxy stable for millennia. Instead, he had walked into a trap that would destroy everything. The ancient entity that had emerged from the artifact watched the chaos unfolding with something that might have been satisfaction. It spoke again, explaining in that reality-shaking voice that humanity's internal conflict was irrelevant. The artifacts would activate regardless of what any human faction wanted. The process had begun the moment the first species discovered the truth, and now it would run its course until the ancient influence was completely removed from this region of space. The chief scientist made a desperate calculation, searching for any variable that could change the outcome. If the artifacts were linked, if they operated as a network rather than individual units, then maybe disrupting the connection could stop the cascade. But her instruments showed something that extinguished that hope immediately. The artifacts were not connected through any conventional means. They were connected through the very fabric of space itself, through the same fundamental layer of reality that the ancient influence had manipulated. Destroying that connection would mean destroying space itself, creating a rupture that would consume the galaxy faster than the artifacts ever could. The real human emissary continued her transmission, and now her words carried a different tone. Not panic, not desperation, but grim determination. She said that the faction that had overthrown humanity's government had made a catastrophic error. They had assumed the artifacts could be controlled once activated, that humanity's 15 years of study had given them mastery over this ancient technology. But humanity had never mastered the artifacts. They had barely understood them. The only thing humanity had truly learned was how to keep them dormant, and now that knowledge was worthless. The tactical advisor watched his displays light up with reports from across the galaxy. The other artifacts were not activating in a coordinated pattern. They were activating in response to each other, each one triggering the next in an exponential cascade. Within minutes, every corner of explored space would be touched by the dead zones. Civilization would fragment into isolated islands, each one struggling to survive with technology that no longer functioned. But then something unexpected appeared in the data. The dead zones were not just destroying the ancient influence. They were mapping it, revealing its structure, showing the Council for the first time the full extent of how they had been manipulated. The historian cross-referenced the emerging patterns with the fragments she had found earlier. The extinct civilizations had left more than warnings. They had left instructions, encoded in the very warnings themselves, hidden so deeply that only someone looking at the complete picture could see them. The instructions were simple and terrifying. The artifacts could not be stopped once activated, but they could be redirected. The ancient influence that controlled the galaxy's technological development was not a natural force. It was a construct, a system, and like any system, it had a source. The artifacts were designed to trace that source, to follow the threads of manipulation back to their origin, and to expose whatever had been hiding there for millions of years. The captain made a decision that went against every protocol, every regulation, every principle of command structure he had ever learned. He opened a direct channel to the ancient entity still hovering near the artifact, and asked a question that no one else had thought to ask. He asked if the entity wanted this to happen. The silence that followed was profound. The being that had seemed so confident, so in control, hesitated. When it finally answered, its voice had lost that resonance of absolute authority. It said that it had been programmed to activate when the truth was discovered, to execute a function it did not fully understand, and that for millions of years it had waited in isolation, hoping that no one would ever find it, because it feared what its own activation would unleash. The chief scientist understood in that moment of clarity. The entity was not the architect of this plan. It was another victim, another tool created by something far older and far more incomprehensible. The artifacts themselves were not weapons against the galactic species or against the ancient influence. They were probes, diagnostic tools designed to examine a patient that was sick, and that patient was the universe itself. The ancient influence that had guided galactic civilization for millions of years was not a control system. It was a treatment, a quarantine, a desperate attempt to keep something contained. The real human emissary's voice broke through the chaos with information that changed everything. She said that humanity's deepest studies of the artifacts had revealed one final function, one capability that had been locked behind barriers they had never managed to break. But the faction that overthrew the government had broken those barriers through brute force, and what they found terrified them into surrender. The artifacts could be deactivated, all of them, simultaneously, instantly. But deactivation required a sacrifice that no species would willingly make. Someone had to merge with the artifact network completely, to become part of its structure, to exist as a living bridge between the old reality and the new one, maintaining both states simultaneously forever. The medical officer reported that the crew members who had been changing were now stabilizing, their transformations reaching a plateau, rather than continuing to spiral out of control. They were not becoming something alien. They were becoming something new, something that could exist in both the manipulated reality and the true reality underneath. They were adapting, evolving in real time, proving that biological systems were more flexible than technological ones. The human emissary confirmed this observation. She said that humanity had been changing slowly over the 15 years they had studied the artifacts. That exposure even to dormant artifacts had altered them on a fundamental level, preparing them for exactly this moment. The fleet commander finally understood the full scope of what humanity had done. They had not hidden the artifacts to keep them secret. They had hidden them to give the galaxy time. Time to change, time to adapt, time to prepare for a transition that would otherwise have been catastrophic. The faction that overthrew humanity's government had not ruined the plan. They had accelerated it, forced it to happen before everyone was ready. But the plan itself was still intact. Humanity had been preparing the galaxy for freedom, not conquest. The ancient entity spoke one final time, and now its voice carried something that might have been relief. It said that its creators had built the quarantine knowing it would eventually fail, knowing that someday a species would evolve beyond the need for guidance, and that species was supposed to inherit the responsibility of maintaining the balance. The entity had watched humanity study the artifacts, had seen them struggle with the moral weight of the knowledge, had observed their internal conflicts and their desperate attempts to do what was right. It said that humanity had passed the test, not through brilliance or military might, but through their refusal to use the artifacts despite having the power to do so. The captain looked at his crew, saw the changes taking hold in them, felt the changes beginning in himself. The choice was no longer about stopping the artifacts or controlling them. The choice was about what kind of galaxy would emerge from this transformation. The overseer's voice came through one last time, weak and distorted through the dead zone's interference, asking for guidance that no one could provide. The political structures were collapsing, the military hierarchies were meaningless, and every species was facing the same terrifying freedom that humanity had been preparing for. The real human emissary made her final transmission, and her words carried the weight of sacrifice that would define generations to come. She said that she was entering the artifact nearest to her position, that she would attempt a merger that could stabilize the transition, that humanity had debated for 15 years about who would bear this burden, and the faction that overthrew the government had actually made the decision easier by proving that no government should be trusted with such power. She said that she had volunteered years ago, had been preparing for this possibility since the day humanity first understood what the artifacts could do, and that she was not afraid because she knew the galaxy would adapt, would survive, would eventually thrive in ways that the ancient influence had never permitted. The fleet commander watched as thousands of artifacts across the galaxy began to synchronize, their countdown sequences aligning into a single moment of transformation. The being near the artifact dissolved back into it, its purpose fulfilled, its ancient vigil finally ended. The display showed civilization fragmenting and reforming simultaneously, chaos and order existing in the same space, the death of one reality and the birth of another happening too fast for anyone to fully comprehend. And in that moment of cosmic transition, sensors detected something that no one had anticipated, something that made every revelation and every twist seem like mere preparation for a truth too vast to understand. The ancient influence was not retreating because it was defeated, but because something it had been keeping outside the galaxy for millions of years had just found a way through the weakening barrier, and that something was coming home. The panic that should have followed never materialized. Instead, something unexpected happened across every ship in the fleet, across every crew member who had been exposed to the artifact's influence. They understood, not through words or data or logical deduction, but through a knowing that existed beyond conventional thought. The thing approaching was not an invader or a threat. It was the other half of a cycle that had been running since before any current civilization had learned to dream. The ancient influence had not been a prison imposed by tyrants. It had been a cocoon, a protective barrier that allowed young species to develop without being overwhelmed by the complexity of true reality. The chief scientist felt tears streaming down her face as equations she had struggled with for decades suddenly made perfect sense. The universe was not one thing but two things existing simultaneously, and the ancient influence had been a filter that only allowed civilizations to perceive and interact with the simpler version. Humanity had not broken through that filter through brilliance. They had broken through because they were ready, because their species had reached a point of development where the training wheels could finally come off. And now, thanks to the artifacts, every other species was being forced to graduate whether they were ready or not. The real human emissary's final transmission came through, her voice calm, despite the magnitude of what was happening to her. She described the merger, the sensation of becoming part of something vast and ancient and purposeful. She said it did not hurt. She said she could feel every artifact across the galaxy, could sense the network they formed, could perceive the way they were weaving together the old reality and the new one. She said that she could see now what the artifact's creators had intended, why they had built this system and hidden it for future generations to find. The quarantine was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be a bridge, and she was now the keeper of that bridge, maintaining the connection between what the galaxy had been and what it was becoming. The captain ordered his crew to scan the approaching presence, expecting readings that would break their instruments or defy comprehension. Instead, they got something remarkably simple. It was the species that had built the quarantine system, returning after millions of years in self-imposed exile. They had left the galaxy to mature without their interference, had created the ancient influence to guide younger species through the dangerous early stages of development, and had been waiting beyond the rim for the signal that someone was finally ready to inherit their responsibility. The artifacts had been that signal, a test disguised as a crisis, and humanity had passed by choosing to save the galaxy rather than rule it. The medical officer reported that the transformations affecting the crew had stabilized completely. They were not losing their old selves or becoming something alien. They were simply gaining the ability to perceive and function in both versions of reality, the simplified one they had grown up with and the true one that existed underneath. It was like suddenly being able to see colors that had always existed but had been invisible before. The universe had not changed. Their ability to perceive it had changed, and with that perception came capabilities that seemed like magic, but were simply natural laws they had been unable to access before. The tactical advisor realized that the military implications he had been so worried about were meaningless now. Every species was gaining these same capabilities simultaneously. There would be no advantage, no supremacy, no domination. The playing field was not being tilted toward humanity. It was being leveled in a way that made the old power structures obsolete. Weapons that relied on the ancient influence would stop working, yes, but so would the hierarchies built on technological advantages that had never been real in the first place. The historian understood that she was witnessing a moment that would define galactic history for millions of years to come. The old records, the fragments she had found, all of them made sense now. The extinct civilizations had not been destroyed for discovering the truth. They had graduated, had ascended to join the builders beyond the rim, and had left their artifacts behind as gifts for whoever came next. Humanity had found them first, but that was less about human exceptionalism and more about human curiosity, their tendency to question everything even when the answer seemed settled. The strategic analyst watched as new governments began forming across the galaxy, not through conquest or political maneuvering, but through simple necessity. The species that adapted fastest were not the ones with the most advanced technology, but the ones most willing to accept change. Humanity was helping where they could, sharing the 15 years of preparation they had undergone, but they were not leading. They were facilitating, which the analyst realized was what they had been preparing to do all along. The security chief received reports that the faction which had overthrown humanity's government had surrendered peacefully once they understood the full scope of what was happening. They had not been villains trying to dominate the galaxy. They had been desperate people who saw a crisis approaching and made a choice they thought would save their species. They had been wrong, but their actions had ultimately accelerated a transition that needed to happen. Sometimes the right outcome emerged from wrong decisions, and that paradox was something the new reality seemed to embrace rather than reject. The overseer's final transmission carried a tone of acceptance rather than defeat. He said that the council as it had existed was dissolved, that the old power structures had served their purpose and were no longer needed. He said that new forms of organization would emerge, built on principles that the old reality had not permitted. He thanked the fleet commander for his service and released him from all previous orders, giving him the freedom to decide for himself what came next. The fleet commander looked out at the assembled armada, thousands of ships from dozens of species, all trapped together in this moment of transformation. But they were not enemies anymore. They were not even competitors. They were students in the same classroom, learning the same lessons, preparing for the same future. He opened a general channel and spoke words that felt inadequate for the moment, but were all he could offer. He said that they would figure this out together, that no one species had all the answers, and that the galaxy would survive this change the same way it had survived countless changes before, through adaptation and cooperation, and the stubborn refusal to give up hope. The ancient builders arrived 3 days later, their vessels moving through space in ways that the transformed observers could finally perceive and understand. They were not gods or conquerors. They were teachers who had been waiting patiently for their students to be ready for the next lesson. They brought knowledge, not through forced downloads or overwhelming data streams, but through patient guidance that respected the pace at which different species learned. They explained that the galaxy had dozens of previous cycles, each one mentored by the previous generation, each one eventually graduating to mentor the next. The human emissary remained merged with the artifact network, but she was not alone. Others volunteered from different species, creating a council not of politicians, but of bridges, individuals who could exist in both realities and help facilitate the transition for those struggling to adapt. She sent messages occasionally, describing the perspective she had gained, the way she could see connections between events separated by millions of years, the patterns that emerged when you stopped looking at individual moments and started seeing the flow of civilizations through time. The chief scientist published the first comprehensive study of the new physics, working with researchers from every species to document what they were learning. The equations were not more complex than the old ones. They were simpler, more elegant, explaining in a few lines what had previously required volumes of mathematics. Reality itself was not complicated. The filter had been complicated, adding layers of obfuscation that made simple truths seem impossible. Years passed, and the transition that everyone had feared would destroy civilization became instead a renaissance. Art flourished as beings gained new ways to express themselves. Philosophy experienced a revolution as questions about the nature of reality found answers that opened up entirely new questions. Even warfare, which many had thought would become catastrophic with these new capabilities, became rare because the underlying causes of most conflicts evaporated when resources and territory stopped being scarce in the ways they had been before. The captain retired from active service and became a teacher, helping the next generation understand not just what had happened, but why it mattered. He told his students that humanity's role in the transition had not been special except in one way. They had been given the opportunity to choose, and they had chosen to help rather than dominate. That choice, more than any technology or capability, was what defined a species worthy of inheriting the galaxy. The fleet commander visited the artifact sometimes, the one that had started everything, now a memorial rather than an active device. He would stand in the dead zone that was no longer dead but simply different, and he would think about how close they had come to disaster and how narrow the margin had been between catastrophe and transcendence. He understood now that every great change in history balanced on similarly narrow margins, that progress was always one bad decision away from becoming tragedy. The galaxy moved forward, not forgetting its past, but no longer bound by it, carrying the lessons learned from the human artifact that had defied all logic, the crisis that had become salvation, and the moment when every species learned that the universe was far stranger, far more beautiful, and far more full of possibility than anyone had ever imagined.